Number 10, key background for reading the New Testament. As I mentioned before, the Bible has 66 books in it. Last time we were just looking at the Old Testament, and in future sessions we'll just be looking at the New Testament. But all together, there are 66 books in the Bible. Isn't that incredible? Doesn't that blow your mind? This is a library, like I said to you before. It's not just a book. And we've looked at the Old Testament. Now we're going to focus on the New Testament. Books 40 through 66, 27 books in the New Testament. But first, before we get into the New Testament and look at the first part of the New Testament, the first part of the New Testament is called the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is the names of the Gospels, 4 of them. Before we look at that, which will be next time, we want to look at what happened between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Because what happened between the Old Testament and the New Testament is important for you to understand the New Testament. So, here's an outline of what I intend to cover with you. I want to look at recent history. When I say recent history, I don't mean in the 21st century. I mean recent history just before the time of Christ. Then I want to look at the geographical and political setting at the time of Christ, Jewish groups, and then important issues that were around at the time of Christ. So let's start with recent history. The Babylonian Empire had conquered Jerusalem. I've talked to you about this over and over. This was the key trauma of the Old Testament. Well, that's not the end of the story. After the Babylonians, guess what? The Persians came, and this interesting king named Cyrus the Great said to all the peoples, everybody can go home now. And so everybody goes home to their ancestral lands, and we have the return from exile. And at that point, Israel becomes a vassal state under the Persian Empire. A vassal state means you have to pay taxes to another empire. Sort of like under the authority of someone else. Then they got conquered by the Greek Empire. The Persian Empire got conquered by the Greek Empire. And who was the great Macedonian? Alexander the Great, if you ever heard of him. He came through, he cut through the whole region like a hot knife through butter. He kept going east, 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 east. He never got off his horse, just kept going, 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 until they were fighting with elephants. Got all the way to India, to the border of India, yeah. Just conquered everything he could. I don't know how old he was, like 30 in his 30s, and he had conquered the whole world. It's so sad, And then he died of some mystery illness, Enigmatic person. Anyhow, the thing about Alexander the Great is that he wasn't satisfied just to conquer and to make vassals or make provinces that he would tax. He wanted to bring Greek culture with him everywhere he went. He wanted to establish the Greek way of doing things in every city he conquered, including urban planning, religion, customs, culture, and language. So the process by which a city or people adopts Greek ways of thinking and living is called Hellenization, because the ancient word for Greece is Hellas. So Hellenization means to Greekify a city or a culture. And there was an allure of Hellenization. And so in Israel, the land that was known as Israel in previous times, there was a tendency to have travelers going through that patch of land, because on the east is desert and on the west is the Mediterranean Sea. And so Israel stands at just like that land bridge to get to Egypt or up to Europe to the west or to Asia in the east. So it really is a trade route of great significance. And so merchants in Israel would learn Greek. Why? Because everybody speaks Greek around you now because of Alexander the Great's success in conquering the world. And the Greeks, they had a really interesting culture. They had ancient histories, like Homer's books, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And these histories have all these epic wars and these stories about the Trojan horse, right? Like really interesting stuff. And the Greeks had poems and plays. They had mathematics, Euclid. They had all these philosophers before Socrates who basically did what we would call science. They had philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. They had superior military tactics. And it was a dominant cultural force. So those are some things that might be attractive to a Jewish person, but there's also some differences in sexual ethics. The Greek was a very liberated person. They had no issues tolerating sex outside of marriage or homosexual sex or pedophilia. Those were all totally fine with the Greek mindset. So this is now like the cultural force that is pressuring people in Israel, and some of the people in Israel are going to say, you know what, I'm going to stick to the law of God. I'm going to stick to what He says is right, and I'm not going to adopt these Greek practices. Whereas others were like, well, if we adopt some of those Greek practices, maybe we could have better trade with our neighbors. And so there was some debate about that. But then there was a king, a Greek king, named Antiochus Epiphanes. And Antiochus Epiphanes said, that's it. I don't care what you think. You're all going to get Hellenized. I don't care if you have your own scriptures. Not anymore, bud. Now you're going to be part of my empire. So this is 2 Maccabees 4:7, where it says, when Seleucus died and Antiochus, who was called Epiphanes, succeeded to the kingdom, Jason, the brother of Onias, obtained the high priesthood by corruption. So these are the main players. You've got Antiochus here, and then you've got Jason. So Antiochus is the Greek king. Alexander the Great had died a long time ago. Antiochus is now the king of the northeastern part of the kingdom. And so he has this Jewish guy named Jason who is now going to be his guy to bring Greek culture into Israel. It says in verse 10, when the king assented and Jason came to office, he at once shifted his compatriots over to the Greek way of life. He destroyed the lawful ways of living and introduced new customs contrary to the law. He took delight in establishing a gymnasium right under the citadel, and he induced the noblest of the young men to wear the Greek hat. There was such an extreme of Hellenization and increase in the adoption of foreign ways because of the surpassing wickedness of Jason, who was ungodly and no true high priest, that the priests were no longer intent upon their service at the altar. Despising the sanctuary and neglecting the sacrifices, they hurried to take part in the unlawful proceedings in the wrestling arena after the signal for the discus throwing, disdaining the honors prized by their ancestors and putting the highest value upon Greek forms of prestige. All right, so let me explain this just a little bit. Antiochus is a really intense guy. He wants all of his provinces to be of the Greek culture. Israel is still weird. It's still practicing its ancient laws. So this guy Jason says, you know what, I think I can help. So Jason brings in a lot of the Greek ways of doing things, like the discus. Do you see that? The discus where you, right? Like in the Olympics. Olympics are a Greek thing. Wrestling is a Greek thing. Wrestling was done naked in the ancient world. They didn't invent athletic clothing yet. And wrestling was done only by guys. And when guys are naked, they notice how the Jews are different than the other guys. I'll leave it there. But it was noticeable, and some of the Jewish guys started to get embarrassed about that, and they started to have surgical procedures to like physically alter their genitals to appear more like the Greeks looked, okay? Which is a pretty extreme example of like adapting to the culture. What about the gymnasium? This is where the wrestling took place. Again, everyone's naked. They just have a different culture than the Jewish culture. Jewish culture is very concerned about purity and, keeping sex within marriage, that sort of thing. Whereas the Greeks they're very free. They have a different mindset on that. And so Jason gives this kind of like soft push towards these things. It doesn't go fast enough. It doesn't go strong enough. So Antiochus says, you know what? I'm just going to make a law, and I'm just going to persecute the people into becoming Greek, whether they like it or not. And we read about that in First Maccabees. Maccabees is not in our Bibles, but it's a historical document written by the Jewish people. So just to mention what Maccabees is. First Maccabees 1:41 says, then the king wrote to his whole kingdom, the king Antiochus, that all should be one people, and that all should give up their particular customs. All the nations accepted the command of the king. Many, even from Israel, gladly adopted this religion. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah. He directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and festivals, to defile the sanctuary and the holy ones, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice pig. You can almost hear the Jewish person like spitting on the ground. To sacrifice pigs and other unclean animals. Jewish people don't eat pork. It's one of their laws. Verse 48, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. They were to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so that they would forget the law and change all the ordinances. He added, and whoever does not obey the command of the king shall die. That is full-on persecution, ladies and gentlemen. You're going to do the Greek way, or else you're going to die. Verse 51. In such words, he wrote to his whole kingdom. He appointed inspectors over all the people and commanded the towns of Judah to offer sacrifice, town by town. Many of the people, everyone who forsook the law, joined them, and they did evil in the land, and they drove Israel into hiding in every place of refuge they had. So the inspectors are going village to village throughout the land of Judea. And they get to a city or village called Modin. And they gather the town together, and they commanded a man named Mattathias, who was of priestly descent, and who was a leader in the town, had a lot of children, well-established, important person. And they said to Mattathias, you offer the sacrifice to this Greek god. The Greeks literally worship different gods. And Mattathias said, even if all the nations that live under the rule of the king obey him and have chosen to obey his commandments, every one of them abandoning the religion of their ancestors, I and my sons and my brothers will continue to live by the covenant of our ancestors. He says, no, I'm not offering this unclean animal to your unclean God. This is a standoff. This is a showdown in the town. So what happens, he doesn't die. You're going to love this. You're going to love this. What happens is another villager, probably just trying to make the peace, comes in and is like, fine, I'll offer the sacrifice. And he goes to offer the sacrifice. Mattathias flies into a rage, kills his own fellow villager, and then knocks over the altar, and then kills the inspectors that were sent from the Greek king. Starts a revolution. Well, they decide they better head to the hills because you can't stay in that village anymore once you just did that. So Mattathias said, let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me. And they went out to the hills and they initiated a revolution using guerrilla war tactics, where they would set traps and they would fight against much bigger militaries and they would win. So Mattathias led the revolution for a year from 167 to 166 BC. This is over a century before Christ, like almost 2 centuries before his crucifixion and resurrection. But this is the big event between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Maccabean Revolution. Okay? And it starts in Modin with this guy Mattathias. Now, why do I call it Maccabean? Well, after Mattathias died, his son, Judah the Maccabee, took over. Nobody knows exactly why he's called the Maccabee, but it sounds kind of like a word that means hammer in another language, so they think, well, maybe he's the hammer. Or there are a couple of other theories about it too, but whatever, it doesn't matter. The fact is, this Judah guy, the son of Mattathias, was a mighty warrior, and he was able to win many battles. But then he died in battle too in the year 160 BC, and his brother Jonathan took over. Jonathan was the leader of the revolution from 160 to 143. He gained independence. They won so many battles against the Seleucids, the Greek Seleucids, that basically they gained their independence of Israel, as it had not been since the days of Zedekiah, the last king, when Jeremiah was the prophet, 4 centuries earlier. I mean, just a long time they had been under the Babylonian and then the Persian and then the Greeks, and now they have this like little window of independence, and it's like, what's this? What's going on here? Well, Jonathan eventually dies, and his brother Simon takes over, and you can see as each one takes over, they expand the size of the kingdom. Initially, it's just Judea, which is Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, but then they conquer a little section to the east of the Jordan called Perea, a few other little sections. And then after Simon dies in the year 135, he makes alliances to ensure stability. His son, John Hyrcanus, takes over, and he conquers Samaria, Idumea, and a southern part of Perea. And at this point, John Hyrcanus is the 3rd generation. So you had Mattathias, you had Judah, Jonathan, and Simon are all brothers, right, of the same generation. But now John Hyrcanus is the 3rd generation. Now we have a dynasty. We're at the 3rd generation, we got a dynasty. So we call this dynasty the Hasmonean dynasty. It's a Jewish kingdom that survives for this whole in-between time, in between the Greeks and the Romans. Because the Greeks had conquered the land, then they had independence, and then the Romans conquered the land. About a century. All right, so John Hyrcanus takes advantage of turmoil among the Greeks. He annexed tons of land, including Samaria, Idumea, and southern Perea. His son Aristobulus I takes over. He only lasts a year, so he doesn't do much. He got sick and died. But his son, Alexander Jannaeus, has a fantastic reign and is able to conquer tons of new territory, Iturea, Gilead, Gaza, all kinds of area around the Dead Sea in the east and the south. And by the time Alexander Jannaeus dies, the kingdom is like roughly the size of Solomon's Golden Age kingdom, which was like 1,000 years earlier. After Alexander Jannaeus, his wife, Salome Alexandria, takes over, and she reigns from 76 to 67 BC, the queen of Israel. There is a queen in the Old Testament too, a lady named Athaliah, but she's really bad. So Salome Alexandria kind of redeems the queenship on behalf of all the ladies, to show like, no, you can have a good queen in Israel. So she's from 76 to 67. And then her son, Hyrcanus II, takes over. He's only in charge for a short time, and then his brother takes it away from him. And Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II fight and fight and fight and fight. Both of them reach out to the Roman general, a guy named Pompey, and say, why don't you go on our side? Pompey says, forget both of you. I'm just going to take over your kingdom and add it to the Roman Empire. So in 63 BC, the whole region becomes occupied by the Roman Empire, mostly due to the incompetence of the Jewish rulers, not so much to the ingenuity of the Roman legions and their battle techniques or anything like that. It's kind of tragic. But then there's a few other rulers that I won't really get into, but then after that, from 37 BC onwards, there's a guy, a wily cat named Antipater. We don't have time to talk about Antipater, but he was an expert politician, and he succeeded in maneuvering his way into power in just such a way that made his son the king. And his son's name is Herod the Great, or as I like to call him, Herod the Worst. But whatever. You call him whatever you want. So Herod the Great initiates his dynasty in the year 37 BC, and he and his descendants basically rule over the area for many, many years to come, all the way through the life of Christ and everything else. Now, how do I know the Hasmonean dynasty was a significant force and in the cultural awareness at the time of Jesus? Well, think about it. Who did Jesus call as his disciples? What were the names of these people? Well, one of them was Peter. What's Peter's real name? Simon. Simon Thassi, the great ruler of the Hasmonean dynasty, whose father, Mattathias, initiated the revolution. What was Simon's older brother's name? It was Judah, which comes into the New Testament as Judas. But it's Judah the Maccabee. That's why there's two Judases among Jesus' followers. Why is there a Matthew? Is Matthew a name in the Old Testament? No, not really. Matthew is from Mattathias. That's just a translation of that same name. So they're naming their kids after these revolutionary heroes, just like in America, everybody knows George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., these like national heroes. They name their kid, well, I guess you don't name your kid George and Abraham much or whatever, but like you get the point. Like these are their heroes that they cherish. And now they're sitting under Roman occupation and they're thinking, you know what? We could really use another Judah the Maccabee today. Somebody to get these Romans out of here like we got the Greeks out. So you can see how relevant this history is in the time of Christ. Let's look at the geographical and political setting at the time of Christ. Now, the Roman Empire was a massive empire, and studying the Roman rulers will help you a little bit to understand the New Testament. Well, it helps you to understand the background of the New Testament. If you really want to go deep in the Roman Empire, I recommend the podcast called The History of Rome by Mike Duncan. He literally begins in the mythological founding of Rome, the city, and goes all the way through the entire Roman Empire for centuries and centuries and centuries. It's incredibly well done, and I learned a lot when I listened to it. So yeah, that's called The History of Rome. But anyhow, the Roman Empire had massive strength and power. Here's a video I took of the Colosseum, just to give you a sense of the perspective of what Roman architecture could be. Now, to build something this big, when you have cranes, you have modern concrete, and you have all our technology, okay, whatever. We have skyscrapers. But to build this on human backs and legs in a time 2,000 years ago, the Colosseum was built shortly after the time of Christ. It was built in the first century. So the Roman Empire was massive, had many different Roman emperors, but the ones I'll just mention are Augustus, who reigned from 27 BC to AD 14. So he's the emperor. Technically, he's the first Roman emperor, and he is the emperor when Jesus is born. Then we have Tiberius Caesar. Tiberius Caesar reigns from 14 to 37. If it's AD or CE, I don't put the letters in. I just put the numbers, okay? So from 14 to 37, Tiberius Caesar is the guy in charge when Jesus is crucified. The person in charge when Pentecost happens, when Paul is converted. Caligula becomes the Caesar from 37 to 41 during the time of Acts early on. Claudius is Caesar from 41 to 54 during Paul's journeys. And Nero becomes Caesar from 54 to 68. From 54 to 68 when Paul's on his third mission, and it's likely that he actually had Paul and Peter both executed, although we can't say exactly for sure to what degree Nero was involved in that. We know that they were executed during his reign in Rome, so it makes sense that Caesar has something to do with it. The Roman Empire was a massive, massive empire surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. So it included modern places like Spain and Morocco and Egypt and Turkey, the whole Mediterranean region. And so these are all considered to be provinces, whereas the Roman Empire proper is just Italy. Okay, so Italy is like the capital of the entire empire, and then everything else is a province that's ruled over by a governor. The governor's job is to keep the peace and send the taxes. Make sense? If the governor is having some sort of a war or a riot, or people are dying and not paying their taxes, because dead people don't pay taxes, right? So that's grounds for that governor to get replaced. So let's talk about the region of the New Testament, especially in the Gospels, we're looking at this region here, what we call today Israel, but at that time it was not called Israel. At that time it was called Galilee, Samaria, and Judea. 3 different regions. And this is where Jesus did his ministry. Okay? So in Galilee, the rulers in the times of the New Testament, at least the early days, were Herod the Great from 37 BC to 4 BC, his son Herod Antipas. So Galilee is up here. I should make a note of that. This is the little Sea of Galilee up here. Beautiful lake. I don't know why they call it a sea. It's fresh water. Anyhow, that's the region of Galilee. It's a very irrigated place, very green, very nice. And so Herod the Great is in charge, and then Herod Antipas, and then Herod Agrippa. This guy was like George Foreman. He called all his kids Herod, and then they called all their kids Herod, right? So we use this secondary name to distinguish them from each other. Which Herod are we talking about? Well, you've got Antipas and Agrippa the first, and there's Agrippa the second, and they're all, like in the Bible, they're just called Herod, so it gets a little confusing. But they know which Herod they're talking about because there's only like one of them in charge at that particular time in that particular place. So that's Galilee. Then in Judea, we've got a lot more rulers because Judea initially is ruled over by Herod the Great. Herod the Great ruled over everything. But after he died, he put his different son in charge of Judea. Judea is down here. Okay, Judea is the southern area. But the Judean ruler also controlled Samaria. So it's actually this whole region. I don't know if that came out. It didn't come out. Okay. This whole region down here is controlled by the... it went to a different slide. That's what happened. Okay. Technical difficulties. So Herod Archelaus gets in power, and you can see he only reigns from 4 BC to AD 6. That's a 10-year span. This guy's a total failure. He's the worst of all the Herods. He basically gets in a fight with the people, loses trust with them. They revolt against him. The Roman emperor says, all right, bud, you're done. And he puts a Roman governor in charge. And so from after Herod Archelaus, Coponius onwards, it's going to be a Roman governor. It's not going to be a Herod. It's going to be a Roman governor. It's going to be direct rule by Rome itself. So if you're in Judea, down here in the south, or if you're in Samaria, guess what? You have a Roman governor to answer to. But if you're up here in Galilee, you have a Herod Antipas to answer to. And Jesus goes between those territories all the time. And at his trial, he's dealing with both. Herod Antipas is there. And so is Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. So these are all significant rulers. You can see there were a lot of different Roman governors sent that ruled in the time of Christ. But this is the one that matters the most for us, Pontius Pilate, who was the governor from 26 to 36. So that's basically Jesus' entire ministry and his crucifixion and resurrection and the start of the book of Acts. That's all in that time frame, 26 to 36. Jesus is crucified around the year 30, between 30 and 33, somewhere in there. People debate it. I don't have a dog in that fight. Paul talks about Herod Agrippa the first. He has an encounter with him. So he's a governor in that period. All right, on to Samaria. Samaria is under Judean jurisdiction, but it's really just this region in between Galilee in the north and Judea in the south. The Samaritans are a really interesting people. First of all, you have to understand about the Samaritans, they believe in just the first part of the Old Testament, just the Torah. They don't believe in the prophets and the writings. They just believe in the first 5 books, and they think the Jews are wrong. They hate the Jews, and the Jews hate the Samaritans. There's a lot of conflict between the two of them. Now, here's something crazy. The Samaritans are still here. They still exist in Samaria. You could go there to Nablus, which I've been to Nablus in Samaria, and they're still there. And they still think the Jews are wrong. And the Jews still think the Samaritans are wrong. You know, it's sort of like the Jewish person looks at the Christian and says, why are you adding all these books to the Bible? Because the Jew just has the Old Testament, the Christian has the Old Testament plus the New Testament. It's the same thing with the Samaritan and the Jew. The Samaritan is saying to the Jew, why are you adding all those extra books to the Bible? We already have the Torah. Why do you have all this other stuff? Right? It's the same kind of thing. Religious disagreements. So here's something cool about the Samaritans. They have their own scrolls of the Old Testament, of the first 5 books. It's called the Samaritan Pentateuch. It survives to this day. And I'm going to show you a picture of that scroll in just a second. The Samaritans had a holy site called Mount Gerizim. Mount Gerizim is right about here on the map, right above the eye of Samaria there. Mount Gerizim is where the Israelites first came into the land, and Moses had them read out the blessings on Mount Gerizim, and they had a shrine there. And so the Samaritans said, this has always been our holy site. We don't believe in Jerusalem. We don't believe Jerusalem is a holy site. We think David was a wacko. We're not into the kings. So they had a disagreement on the legitimacy of the temple that Solomon built. They don't like the temple. They're like, we already have Mount Gerizim. What do we need a temple down there for? We don't need a temple down there. So in the time of Jesus, if you live up here in Galilee, you want to come down to Jerusalem. And when you get down to Jerusalem, down here, that's where the temple is. And that's where you're going to offer sacrifice, and that's where you're going to give money, and that's where you're going to worship. You're supposed to travel down here. The fastest way to get down is to go straight through Samaria. But the Samaritans don't like you. So there's actually a time where Jesus and his disciples are traveling down to Jerusalem to attend one of the festivals, and none of the Samaritans will let them stay in their villages. And one of the disciples says to Jesus, Lord, should we call fire down from heaven to destroy these people? And Jesus is like, no. What's the matter with you? And, he says, just keep going to the next place. So, that's kind of a little bit of the background of the Samaritans. Many of their manuscripts have survived, and they're very interesting, their manuscripts. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see. Their manuscripts, like I mentioned, are just the first 5 books of the Bible, and there are some kind of obvious corruptions, but there are other places where I think they offer a corrective to other later manuscripts. But what's fascinating about the Samaritan manuscripts is that they're not written in the kind of Hebrew script that people who read Hebrew today are familiar with. They're written in a Paleo-Hebrew script that, even if you study Hebrew, you cannot read this. This is a different kind of alphabet that I think it's the same alphabet, but a different kind of script that they use to do it. All right, let's move on to Jewish groups. I want to cover 6 Jewish groups. Obviously, I don't have enough time to go into any of them in much detail, but I just want to give you a thumbnail sketch of Sadducees, Pharisees, Sanhedrin, scribes, revolutionaries, and John the Baptist movement. All right, first up, we've got our Sadducees. They controlled the temple. The Sadducees were significant. They were powerful. They were aristocrats. They owned big houses. They knew the governor of Rome, Pontius Pilate or whoever it happened to be, depends on what time period we're talking about, and they had a working relationship with the Roman governor. They also had control of the priesthood, like the chief priest and the high priest were all Sadducees during the time of Christ. They agreed with the Samaritans that only the Torah was scripture and that the prophets and the writings were not considered scripture. So that's kind of interesting over against the Pharisees. And they didn't believe in resurrection or angels. So that's the Sadducees, just a couple of words on them. Pharisees accepted the whole Old Testament as legitimate. The Pharisees were the ones who eventually become the rabbis that develop into the Jews of today. Okay, rabbinic Judaism and so forth into the medieval period. So the Pharisaic Judaism is the Judaism that survives and outperforms all the other forms of Judaism in the first century. But nobody knows that's going to happen. They're all competing for adherence and for influence throughout the time of the first century. So the Pharisees focused on obedience to Torah. They didn't focus on the temple. The Sadducees controlled the temple and the sacrifices and the money. The Pharisees focused on obedience, righteousness, and the traditions of the elders. The traditions of the elders is how you interpret the laws of Moses. The law of Moses says don't work on the Sabbath. So does that mean you can't go anywhere? Well, they had this idea of a Sabbath day's journey established by the elders. And the Pharisees are like, well, this is exactly how far a Sabbath day's journey is, and that's how far we're going to go. So that's the Pharisees. They accepted the law, the prophets, and the writings. They had been very powerful in previous times, but by the time of Jesus, they were very influential among the people, but not very influential among the government. All right, then we have the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was a council, a law court that the Romans established. They established 5 councils throughout the land over 5 districts. The one that's relevant to us is the Sanhedrin of Jerusalem. The Sanhedrin of Jerusalem made decisions on important cases. They had control over the police in the region of Jerusalem, and so they could arrest people, they could try people, they could whip people, punish them, fine them, but they could not execute people. Only the Roman governor could approve an execution. So when it comes to the time of Christ, they have to work with the governor to say, this guy, you should really kill this guy. Because they know they couldn't do it. They didn't have permission to do it. The Sanhedrin did not. All right, then we have scribes. Scribes are people that copy the Bible. This sounds strange to us because, like, why wouldn't you just hit the print button? Or why wouldn't you just buy it from, buy it online or whatever? Well, they didn't have any of that technology, so they're hand copying, and this is incredibly valuable. This is how the scriptures get into the different synagogues in the world, is you have professionally trained scribes who are incredibly accurate at properly copying every single letter in a scroll and counting up all the words and all the letters, making sure everything is accurate. However, in addition, because they were such great copiers, they knew the Bible. They were the experts on the law of Moses. And so if you had a dispute, a question about interpretation, you want to bring a scribe in because they know the book. And the scribe is going to tell you what the book says. Then we had revolutionaries. This is also called the fourth philosophy, and I'll let Josephus tell you about them. I should mention that Josephus is a Jewish historian who wrote a book. Well, he wrote several books, but 2 important books are Antiquities of the Jews and the Jewish War. It was Roman War or Jewish War? Whichever one. The Jewish War with Rome. And so you can get this for yourself. It's not that expensive. It's all translated into English, which is really helpful. And Josephus gives you all the gossip you'd ever want to know about the Roman rulers, about the aristocrats, about the, this one did that and this one did that. And he gets into all the court intrigue and whatnot. But he talks about the revolutionaries, and he says, but of the 4th sect of Jewish philosophy, Judah the Galilean was the author. These men agree in all other things with the Pharisaic notions, but they have an inviolable attachment to liberty and say that God is to be their only ruler and Lord. They also do not value dying any kind of death, nor indeed do they heed the deaths of their relations and friends, nor can any such fear make them call any man Lord. So these revolutionaries, they start revolutions, both before Jesus' ministry and after his ministry. And it could be that one of his followers, Simon, called the Zealot, was one of these revolutionaries. All right? That's hard to say for sure. But just so you know, there are revolutionaries about, and in the year 66, they get their revolution, and they fight the entire Roman Empire head on in a military conflict. Sadly, they lose, but it's an impressive group of people. Then you have John's movement. We call him John the Baptist, right? That's what he's called in the Bible. I just call it John's movement here. He calls the people to repent. He baptizes them in the Jordan River. This is weird. There is no such thing as baptism in the Old Testament. There are ritual cleansings and stuff like that, but nothing connected to morality where you're repenting of your sins. So John is initiating this unusual movement, and he has some things that make him strongly resemble the Essenes. I have not talked about the Essenes yet, but the Essenes were another Jewish group that lived out in the desert regions in intentional communities and who had basically concluded that the temple system was too corrupt and they didn't want anything to do with it. So they're living out in the desert and they're ascetics, or at least prone to asceticism, where they don't, they're not embracing a lot of pleasures of life. They're very focused on holiness. And so here comes John the Baptist, and he's wearing camel hair, and he's coming out of the desert, and he's eating wild honey. He's a scavenger. He's eating wild honey and locusts, and he's calling everyone to repentance, to this moral purity. It kind of sounds like an Essene to a lot of scholars. But the idea is that John the Baptist was phenomenally successful. It says in the Gospels that all of Judea came out to be baptized by John in the Jordan. People responded extremely well to John. Decades later, after John the Baptist is even beheaded and he's executed, Paul is hundreds of miles away in the city of Ephesus, and he finds disciples of John the Baptist there. And it's like, well, how did these guys get here? Right? Because he was that influential in his time. And of course, when Jesus gets his start, which we'll look at next time, when Jesus gets his start, the first thing he does is he associates with John the Baptist. He connects in with his ministry, and they have some interchange. All right, let's look at just a few quick issues, and then we'll be done. In the time of Christ, in the New Testament, what was important? Well, the temple was really important. There was actually a time where Jesus' disciples came up to him and say, "Isn't this incredible how great a job they've done renovating this temple?" And Jesus says, not one stone is going to be left upon another that won't be destroyed. He prophesies the destruction of the temple. Unthinkable to do that. And yet it happened. What was that? 30, 35 years after Christ, they actually destroyed the entire, and it's never been rebuilt to this day. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Nobody's ever rebuilt the Jewish temple. Even if you go today, it's not there. There's no Jewish temple. There are 2 Muslim mosques on the site where the Jewish temple used to be. No Jewish temple. The Jews had struck a deal with Caesar to offer sacrifices on his behalf. In the Roman religion, just like in the Greek religion, you offer sacrifices to all these different gods. And they wanted a sacrifice for Caesar. The Jews said, can we just do it? We'll do a sacrifice to our God for you. Is that good enough? And they said, yeah, it's good enough. We'll take that. So there was some negotiating that happened there. So they had to have a sacrifice on behalf of Caesar, but to God. And the Romans had built a fortress right next to the temple courtyard. So they had their soldiers overlooking this gathering space so that if there was a riot that was going to break out, they had the soldiers ready to go in. And they also controlled the vestments for the high priest. These are all spelled out in meticulous detail in the book of Leviticus. Right down to his underwear, I'm not kidding, what the high priest is supposed to wear. These are sacred clothing that he would wear on the Day of Atonement when he went into the Holy of Holies. You know who controlled that? The Roman governor. So the high priest had to negotiate with the Roman governor to get the holy clothing to go into the holy place on the holy day, right? So you're getting a sense of the time of Jesus, the tensions with Rome, and the background of this whole Hasmonean battle, this revolution, successful revolution that happened that they told stories about, and they're naming their kids after. To call yourself the Messiah in the time of Christ was the same as to say, arrest me. You know what I mean? Because to be a Messiah is to be a king. To be a king is to defy the Roman Empire. And so that all plays into the ministry of Christ. Taxes. Taxes were hugely controversial at the time of Christ. Should Jewish people pay taxes to Rome? Why should we pay taxes to Rome? They're the occupiers. This is God's land. He gave it to our forefathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. You want me to pay taxes to these uncircumcised Gentile pigs? You could just kind of hear the heat of that debate. And then you had some Jews who said, you know what, you can't beat them, join them. I'll collect the taxes for you. And one of Jesus' disciples is an ex-tax collector, right? So there's a lot of tension going on with taxes. Then Torah. How should you interpret the Torah? There are different schools of thought. There were two famous rabbis before the time of Christ called Hillel and Shammai. The house of Hillel said one thing about how to interpret this law. The house of Shammai said another thing about how to interpret this law. And they had their disciples. And then after the time of Christ, there was a famous rabbi named Akiva. And the house of Akiva interpreted it this other way. Well, Jesus is he's in the conversation with all this. He says, well, this is how I think you should interpret it. A lot of his discussions are going back and forth. This is one interpretation. This is another. What does Rabbi Jesus say about this? And then, as I alluded to a lot, unrest under Pontius Pilate. Pilate was not a good governor. He caused several riots, both before the time of Christ and afterwards, where he was just incredibly insensitive to Jewish sensibilities. At one point, he brought in all these standards with their flags and the image of Caesar on them, and all the Jews revolted. At one point, they put a golden eagle in front of the temple, which is just like, to the Jewish mindset, that's a graven image. Like, you want to start a riot, go ahead, put an idol near the temple, anywhere near it, go ahead. So there were several riots, and Jesus basically lived on the precipice of history. He lived in a time where there was a revolutionary mindset. It didn't yet break out, but it could at any moment. They didn't know it was going to take 30 more years until the big war. It was a politically charged time, and claiming to be the Messiah was like lighting a match near a powder keg. Let's review. When the Greeks conquered the world, they made cities adopt their customs, culture, language, and religion. When Antiochus Epiphanes forcibly Hellenized Judah, it resulted in the Maccabean Revolution under Mattathias and his sons. After they won their independence, the Hasmonean dynasty ruled up until 63 BC, when Pompey annexed Judea into the Roman Empire. Herod the Great and his descendants ruled over the region for many years, though in Judea, the Romans directly ruled through governors. During Jesus' ministry, Herod Antipas ruled in Galilee, and Pontius Pilate governed Judea and Samaria. Sadducees partnered with the Roman government and controlled the temple. Pharisees focused on obedience to Torah and according to the tradition of the elders. The Sanhedrin was a council in Jerusalem made of Sadducees and Pharisees that controlled the police force and ruled on legal issues. I didn't mention that, but the Pharisees were also part of the Sanhedrin. Scribes copied scripture and had expert knowledge of the law of Moses. Jesus lived in a time of fragile peace when Roman provocations threatened to light the match of Jewish revolution at any moment. All right, so next time we'll look at the Gospels, and we'll look at how Jesus navigated this world, and what did he have to say to the powers that be and to the common people, and how did he minister to them as we continue in our class, How to Read the Bible for Yourself.